So I started off as a marine biologist and I moved to Australia to do my PhD studying corals and climate change. And about a year into doing my PhD, I started going to a pottery class in the evenings. I absolutely fell in love with it. Eventually I started teaching my own classes after a couple of years. So I moved back to the UK in 2020. I moved to Devon and I moved onto a farm. That's where I first got into wild clay. So on the farm there was a stream down in the valley, and when you went down to the stream you could see these chunks of clay in the river. I would go in, pick up these pieces of clay, put them in my bucket and walk all the way up the valley back to my studio. And that's when I started really testing, what could happen with clay that you've just picked up from a stream. So after 2 years on the farm, I moved to Dartmoor. My work is very inspired by my surroundings. My current body of work using wild clay collected in Devon encompasses all of this. I use stencils that include animal motifs, wildlife that you find around here, Dartmoor ponies, foxes, birds, and I use these stencils with wild clay slips. I've collected various different wild clays from locations around Devon. Recently I've collected clay from my friend's farm about 15 minutes away from Dartmoor, and within this brook there are multiple different sites where you can collect clay, and each different place you get completely different outcomes, different colours once they're fired. When I collect clay, I collect really small batches, and I make sure I'm really conscious about not affecting the local habitat, so just taking what I need and not too much. I love using wild clay or foraged, found clay, local clay, because it's so wonderful to be able to get your hands dirty and pick out clay from the ground, bring it straight back to the studio and make something with it. Humans have been collecting clay for tens of thousands of years, and to be part of that is really special. When I collect clay from the stream, the first thing I do is take a bit of clay and just smush it in my fingers and feel if it's slick and sticky. That's quite often a good indicator that you've found clay. I then make a small pinch pot. This is quite often a good, simple first test to see how plastic your clay is. So if you're able to make a pinch pot that doesn't crack or crumble, then you know you're onto something good. I'd also collect a little bit, roll it around in my hands to make a sausage, and then bend the sausage into a rainbow. And this is another good test for plasticity, because you can see if there are any cracks in the rainbow arc. I'll bring the clay back to the studio and take it out of my bucket, and I will take each clod of clay and actually crumble it up and break it up with my fingers. And I do this because if there are any stones or roots in the clay, I can pull them out quite easily, but also because some of the clay might be wetter than other parts of the clay, so I'm sort of homogenizing it. And once I've crumbled or crushed it all up, I then wedge that clay into a lump to really sort of get that even moisture throughout, and also any bits of like iron oxide that you can see running through the clay gets sort of smoothed in with the rest of it. After I've wedged up the clay, I will make a slab, or actually 3 slabs from the clay. I'll make sure that all the test tiles are of the same size, and this is so I can see how much they shrink in the different firings. This is important because as temperature increases, clay will shrink as it becomes denser, and the clay will reach a peak density, and that's when it will reach its maximum shrinkage. Temperatures beyond that, the clay will actually start to expand again and then eventually melt. So you can actually use your bisque tile and your stoneware tile next to each other to see If the stoneware tile has shrunk, then that's probably okay. If it's started to expand and it's bigger than the bisque tile, then it's probably overfired. It's also really important to put your tiles in a bowl or on a spare bit of kiln shelf so that if they do melt, they don't ruin your kiln. When I throw with wild clay on the wheel, I start by centering the clay. I do this quite carefully because sometimes with the wild clay I use, it doesn't like to be overworked. So as few sort of hand movements as possible is best for this clay. I then put my finger in the middle and open up the clay quite wide because I'm making a shallow dish or bowl shape. And I do that nice and slowly. Once I've opened up the bowl, I make sure I compress the base really well over and over again. And this sort of pushes the clay particles together so that when the bowl dries eventually, you don't get a crack forming. I then pull the walls out into the shape that I want, and I use a rib just to smooth off any slip that's still on the bowl. And this sometimes brings out the nice sort of variations that you still have in the clay, even though you've wedged it and it's homogenized. There are still some little like iron spots and specks. I then use a chamois just to smooth the edge and take the bowl off the wheel. After the piece has been made, I let it firm up for a couple of days, depending on what the weather's like or how warm the studio is. And then I turn it over and trim a shallow foot ring into the base. Once I've trimmed the piece, I put my maker's mark on the underneath. To decorate my wild clay pieces, I use slips that are made from other clays. I use a white slip that is a ball clay that has been left from a local quarry that's been turned into a nature reserve. This is in dry form. I crush up this clay with a pestle and mortar not into a fine powder, but just into smaller lumps. And then I add that to water and let it slake down. You can leave it overnight to slake down, or you can use a blender to homogenize the clay or suspend the clay within the water. And once you've got the consistency that you want, you can then sieve that. I pass the slip through a 50 mesh sieve and transfer that into a bottle and label it. I cut out stencils from paper with animals, trees, birds, almost like they're ancient creatures, cave paintings, just sort of simple silhouettes that evoke some sort of emotion. I stick the stencil shapes onto the wild clay dish with a bit of water. I also paint some of the stencils with slip before I stick them down, which means when I put a different coloured clay slip over the top, I have the two contrasting colours. I then paint over the top with slip. Once the slip has firmed up a bit, the sheen has left the surface, I use tweezers and a craft knife to lift and pull up the stencils. This body of work I prefer to leave unglazed because I love the texture and the earthy colours that come from the raw clay. They really remind me of where the clay's come from. I take this clay up to cone 6, 7 in my electric kiln, and I know that it's vitrified because of the tests that I've done. That means this piece can be decorative or it can be functional. What I love most about pottery is that you can experiment forever. There is no one final piece. You can make something, be inspired by something small on that piece, take it further and really develop a body of work based on something that's small that inspired you. When I'm making these pieces, because they're quite time consuming, while I'm doing it, I'm almost creating a story in my mind and building that story up with the stencils. So I might put a fox in, and then a hare and a deer and trees and bluebells and a river and Dartmoor and the sunshine. But it all creates this sort of idyllic picture in my mind. People can look at these pieces and they can have their own story that they put to the piece.